Procedures were correctly followed, and it was a righteous strike.
Since 2002, there have been thousands of drone strikes conducted by the US government, and this is a map of those strikes. This map relies on publicly available data collected by the New America Foundation and the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, because there's no reliable government data on drone strikes, and the US government, they seem to prefer it that way. Drone strikes and coalition aircraft guided by drones quickly became the preferred tool in the war on terror, and for political leaders who didn't want to put troops on the ground, they were a huge benefit. I've been deep diving the drone war for weeks, pulling up policy documents, leaked memos, old disclosures, and mapping, and doing a lot more data cleaning than I expected. And yet, the data and this map is full of holes. Holes in Iraq, holes in Syria, in places where we know conclusively that drone strikes have taken place. But I think a lack of information can sometimes tell just as much of a story. The story of how the government hid the drone war from you. Because the drone war has had a secondary benefit to the US government, aside from not needing to send troops abroad. The drone war has been conducted away from the public eye. As the drone war expanded in scope from fighting Al-Qaeda to the Taliban, to Al-Shabaab, to ISIS, drone warfare became the preferred tool for combating terrorism, and it did so without any real public scrutiny. Hundreds, now thousands of strikes in half a dozen countries. The strikes took place in remote areas with no press access and no scrutiny. This was sold to the American public as the most precise air campaign in history, and supporters of drone warfare often claim that drones are significantly more discriminate than traditional warfare, meaning they kill less innocent civilians. But the more we investigate the drone war, the less this seems to be true. From independent reporting to leaked government documents, it's clear the US government has cleverly used policies and bureaucracy to artificially keep civilian deaths low and keep the drone war in the dark. So what is the true story of the US drone war? Are drones genuinely a more discriminate means of warfare? And how did the US government keep a destructive and often negligent air campaign out of the public eye? To fully understand the drone war, you need to understand the kinds of drone strikes most often taken by the US government. There are three major kinds of strikes: signature strikes, personality strikes, and double tap strikes. Look at this footage of a Turkish drone tracking enemy combatants in Syria. The pilot doesn't know the identities of these people, but the drone is able to observe enemy behavior. It sees them firing weapons. This is what a signature strike looks like. And this is the most common type of drone strike. The US government often gives the impression that drone strikes are only made against specific, high-value targets. This is not the case. Signature strike targets are made via profiling and done broadly without presidential approval. Sometimes, like in this clip, this can be straightforward. Drone strikes taken against combatants actively firing on coalition troops. But this isn't always the case. Behavior isn't always straightforward from half a world away. Signature strikes frequently fail in countries where the US government doesn't have human intelligence on the ground, which, based on our map, is where many drone strikes happen. Signature strikes hit people who are traveling armed, but do so because they're on their way to a wedding. Sometimes people are targeted because they stop to pray at dawn on the side of the road, which analysts interpret as them burying an explosive device. Sometimes a person loading water cans into their car looks like them picking up a bomb. And when behavior is misinterpreted in this way, civilians die. This is a slide from a leaked Pentagon briefing. It describes the chain of command for taking a drone strike and how targets are developed. The slide is describing the second type of strike, a personality strike. A strike made against a target with a known identity on order of the president, usually a high-value target, terrorist leaders or facilitators. Knowing their identity might lead you to believe that personality strikes are highly accurate, but they also come with a bunch of problems. Sometimes it's a simple case of mistaken identity. Someone who looks like the intended target is killed. Someone in the immediate area the drone couldn't see is killed. Or the wrong person is killed entirely. This is because personality strikes rely heavily on cell phone signal data. Intercepted conversations, phone geolocation data, often provided by the NSA. But here's the thing. Potential targets quickly figured out that they were being tracked by their phones, so they started swapping SIM cards, trading phones, or if they didn't know about the cell phone tracking, they lend their phone to a family member, or they leave the phone in an area with innocent civilians around. Because, as interviews with insiders of the drone program have revealed, personality strikes aren't really targeting a person, they're targeting a cell phone. This is why Jeremy Scahill of The Intercept has come to refer to this as death by metadata. The final type of strike is what is known as a double tap strike. And you can probably guess from the name, this is when after striking the primary target, a second strike is conducted when people show up to render aid. The problem is, people who show up to render aid are frequently innocent civilians, people who don't understand what happened, friends and family of innocent people potentially caught in the first strike, and first responders. One incident was reported in Pakistan where a double tap strike was performed the next day on a funeral procession for a person killed in the first strike. Each of these types of drone strikes has a lot of problems, lots of potential points of failure. But what does this look like in reality? Let's look at some specific cases of how drone strikes go wrong. In August of 2021, the US military was in the middle of a full withdrawal from Afghanistan, bringing an end to 20 years of war there. The situation was tense as Taliban forces quickly swept across the country, and ISIS had attacked the Kabul airport just 3 days earlier. On August 29th, a drone circling over the capital clocked a man who we now know is named Zamari Ahmadi. He was tracked as he visited what the US military believed to be an ISIS safe house. He loaded his car with what looked like a bomb, and it was determined that Ahmadi must be an ISIS facilitator, a threat to troops at the nearby airport. Later that day, when Ahmadi arrived home, an MQ-9 Reaper drone launched a Hellfire missile, killing him and 9 others, 7 of which were children. This is a textbook example of a signature strike, and how they so often go horribly wrong. Independent investigations reconstructed the timeline of Ahmadi's day. He left for work around 9. He received a call from his boss, asking him to pick up a laptop for him on the way to work. He picked up 2 co-workers as part of their carpool, and he stopped for breakfast. After work, he dropped off his co-workers, and he made a stop to pick up tanks of water for his family, as water deliveries had stopped with the full-scale collapse of the Afghan government. All this behavior was interpreted by the military as threatening, but Ahmadi wasn't part of ISIS. He worked for a US-based NGO, and he was hoping that he and his family would be resettled in the United States. But the thing is, this strike isn't an outlier. It's not really an isolated incident. Remember, this was sold as the most accurate air war in history, and yet there are dozens and dozens, hundreds of events just like this and worse. Coalition forces fighting against ISIS in Syria killed 120 civilians, primarily women and children, because a defensive strike was called in at a remote town called Baghouz, where ground troops were engaged with a few remaining ISIS fighters. Because of a lack of coordination and reliance on a drone with a low-definition camera, a coalition aircraft dropped 3 bombs, despite all reports indicating that there was no active combat in the area and a defensive strike wasn't actually needed. For all intents and purposes, this was a double-tap strike, a 500-pound bomb, followed by 2 2,000-pound bombs that targeted any survivors. A strike against an ISIS explosives factory in an occupied village resulted in massive secondary explosions, flattened half the village and killed at least 70 also in Syria in 2016 against what the military thought was an ISIS facility, killed 9 civilians. That the ISIS facility was simply a cotton gin on the farm. Because of fears that ISIS forces were massing for a counterattack against ISIS vehicles, killing an unknown number of civilians up to 24. I can pull up incidents like these all day. They aren't rare. And we only know about these because of excellent reporting from the New York Times and the release of what they call the civilian casualty files. So here are some takeaways from those files. Not a single incident led to a finding of wrongdoing on behalf of US forces, and only 4 incidents led to any kind of payments to survivors. And there are some serious issues with how the government investigates potential civilian deaths. The playbook for managing public opinion about drone strikes and minimizing the appearance of civilian deaths has a few simple steps that I'm calling deny, ignore, and downplay. These three reports represent basically everything the US government publicly says about the drone war. I'm going to break these down for you. The first report was created as a result of an executive order signed by President Obama. It provides a yearly tally of drone strikes and civilian deaths. But this is what the report looks like: 3 pages, one small table, and a long justification why the death toll in the report is probably much lower than what external investigations find. Side note, only 2 of these reports exist. The executive order was ignored and later struck down by Trump. And you'll note that these reports also use the phrase outside areas of active hostilities, which means anywhere the US is engaged in war isn't included in this document. So no Iraq, no Afghanistan. Reports like this are common for US military disclosures. US Africa Command and coalition forces fighting against ISIS have similar quarterly press releases that most often look something like this: a lengthy document with a list of incidents, usually 2 sentences per incident, max. This lack of information lets the government closely control the narrative of the drone war. They deny access to any real information about drone strikes and how accurate they are. But sometimes they can't deny that a strike took place, and they need to look into claims of civilian casualties. This is a US government civilian casualty report. It's a long, highly redacted document in most cases that goes over the whole process of investigating a claim of civilian death from a drone strike. One thing we know for sure: the vast majority of civilian casualty claims are dismissed as non-credible. The strikes are completely ignored. And there are some serious problems with how the US military investigates civilian casualties. External reviews have pointed out that when faced with a claim of civilian casualties, military investigators regularly miss easily accessible information. They refuse to interview civilian witnesses. They fail to visit sites of drone strikes. And generally, they don't provide enough resources for a full and thorough investigation. Which should have you wondering, is the US military unable to investigate their degree of culpability in civilian deaths, or are they simply unwilling? But sometimes they can't deny, and they can't ignore that a strike took place. So they default to step 3, they downplay. Investigators regularly disagree with the civilian death counts reported by independent media, and unfortunately, in many cases, we're not allowed to see the evidence they used to make this decision. The information is redacted. But we know one thing. As reported by many sources, the government uses a very suspicious method of counting civilian deaths. In short, if someone killed by a drone strike is a military-aged male who is in an active combat zone, they are often considered an enemy combatant and not counted as a civilian. And by the way, military age is any male over 16 years old. And when you combine this with the signature strikes that we discussed earlier, you have a situation in which potentially very large civilian casualties are undercounted and downplayed or completely denied by the government. So now hopefully you have a better sense of what the US drone war has been, in terms of scale, but also how individual incidents are hidden from you by the government. And yet, with all this data, these government reports, and these leaked documents, all I'm really giving you is a peek through the keyhole. You should assume that every country on this map has many, many more strikes than appear here. The drone war has been most often discussed in terms of accuracy. How accurate is a drone strike? How often do they kill the intended target? How often do civilians die? It's definitely important to understand how the drone program operates, but I don't think the question of how discriminate drones are is what you should be most concerned about. The question we should be asking is whether this is an acceptable amount of power for a single person. The president has the power to assassinate anyone on the kill list at any time, as long as they're in a country that can't reasonably retaliate or cause a diplomatic incident. The drone program has fundamentally changed the way the United States wages war. Before drones, waging war had a cost that had to be balanced with public opinion, a cost that had to be explained and justified to the American people. But no longer. A drone pilot isn't in danger. There are no troops on the ground. A pilot on an air-conditioned base in Nevada flies a drone launched from a base in Djibouti with the goal of killing terrorists in Yemen, and you never hear about it. the threshold to commit violence against people abroad is lowered to the floor. And this changes the decision-making process. Why not launch the drone strike? There are no real consequences. We can see that in the reports. Not a single incident where the military was considered at fault. For now, the Biden administration has paused the drone war, and they're conducting a total review of US drone policy. You can imagine why Biden might be wary of using drones as a counterterrorism tool after the strike in Kabul. And yet, I would be wary to think of this as progress. After all, President Biden was part of the most prolific drone striking administration in the nation's history. Regardless, Biden's decision won't matter much in the long run. In just 2 short years, a new administration could flip the switch on the drone program, because the US government hasn't learned the lesson of the failed drone war just yet. If you made it this far, thank you for watching the video. These videos take a lot of work, a lot of research, and a lot of editing. So if you enjoyed the video, if you felt like you learned something, I'd appreciate it if you would throw me a subscribe. One interesting takeaway that I didn't feel like I had time to talk about in this video, or would have made it too long, was a particular part of the map that I'll put here somewhere, is the northern border of Pakistan, which was pretty uniquely devastated by the drone war. I'll leave a paper in the description. It's going to be in the source list that I used pretty heavily as part of the research for this video, that talks about how the drone war was conducted in northern Pakistan and how heinous some of the crimes were in that area, if you're interested. But I think that's a story for another time.